The laughter started before Silas Crenshaw even finished unloading his mule. It was October of 1853, and the air in the little settlement of Boone's Hollow, Tennessee, smelled of wood smoke and dying leaves. 3 families had staked their claims along the creek that spring, raising cabins of tulip poplar and chinked clay, clearing bottomland for corn. They were proper settlers, men with wives, axes, and ambition. They had come west from the Carolinas with seed corn and iron cookware, and plans to turn this unnamed valley into something civilized. Silas had come with a mule, 2 crates of books, and a worn leather satchel containing a geologist's hammer, a compass, and a hand lens his father had given him before dying of consumption in a rented room in Asheville. "You aiming to farm that ridge?" called Thomas Harker from across the creek, leaning on his splitting maul. His wife, Dorcas, stood behind him with her arms folded, already frowning. "No, sir," Silas said. "I'm aiming to live in it." He pointed up the limestone bluff that rose behind the settlement like a gray wall, its face pocked with shadow where water and time had eaten holes through ancient rock. One of those holes, a wide arched opening perhaps 8 feet tall, gaped like a mouth halfway up the slope, framed by cedars that clung to the stone with roots like fingers. Thomas Harker laughed first, then Dorcas, then the Burrell brothers, who had come out of their cabin to watch the stranger arrive, laughed too, their voices bouncing off the bluff and coming back doubled. "A cave," said Dorcas Harker, shaking her head. "The man wants to live in a cave like some manner of beast." Silas said nothing. He tightened the rope on his mule and started up the slope. He had found the cave 3 months earlier, in July, during a solitary surveying trip through the Cumberland Plateau. He'd been walking the ridge lines with his father's compass, mapping outcrops of Mississippian limestone, not because anyone had hired him to, but because it was the only work that quieted the restless hum in his mind. Silas was the youngest of 3 brothers. His father, Amos Crenshaw, had been a self-taught mineralogist who spent 30 years collecting specimens from the hills of western North Carolina, cataloging them in careful handwriting, and dying without a dollar to show for any of it. When the old man passed in the spring of 1853, the 2 elder brothers, Marcus and Henry, had divided the family's small farm between themselves in a kitchen table negotiation that took less than an hour. Silas, who had been in the next room reading to his dying father, was given the books, the instruments, and a suggestion from Marcus's wife, Eleanor, that he might find employment in one of the Asheville hotels. "You're a clever boy," Eleanor had said, in a tone that made cleverness sound like a disease. "Surely someone has use for that." Marcus had the decency to look uncomfortable. Henry did not. Henry had already calculated the value of the timber on his half of the property and was planning to sell to a sawmill operator from Charlotte. Silas packed his father's books into 2 wooden crates, Lyell's Principles of Geology, Dana's System of Mineralogy, a well-thumbed copy of Humboldt's Cosmos, and 27 other volumes that represented everything Amos Crenshaw had valued more than money, loaded them onto a mule he bought with his last $14, and walked west. He had no destination. He had a direction. West into the mountains, away from the brothers who had parceled out a dead man's life and found nothing in it worth keeping except dirt. The knowledge, though. The knowledge was Silas's inheritance, and unlike the debts his father also left behind, no one could take it from him. The cave entrance faced southeast, which Silas noted immediately. Southeast exposure meant morning sun in winter, shade from the brutal afternoon heat of summer. The opening was wide but not cavernous, 12 feet across, tapering to a rough arch overhead. He ducked inside, expecting the damp chill common to shallow overhangs. Instead, he felt warmth, not heat, not the trapped, stale air of a sealed space, a gentle, steady warmth like standing near a banked hearth. The temperature outside had been 92 degrees that afternoon, the air thick with humidity. Inside the cave, the air was dry and cool by comparison. But when he pressed his palm against the limestone wall, it was warm, not from the sun. The sun hadn't touched these walls in millennia. The warmth came from somewhere deeper. Silas Crenshaw sat down on the cave floor and stayed for 3 hours, thinking. He knew, from his father's books, from his own reading, from a tattered copy of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology that he'd carried across 2 states, that the earth itself held heat. Deep limestone formations, insulated by hundreds of feet of rock, maintained a steady temperature year-round, somewhere between 52 and 58 degrees Fahrenheit in this latitude. But this cave was warmer than that. He measured it at 61 degrees with the small mercury thermometer he kept in his satchel. The walls were 63. There had to be a reason, and Silas intended to find it. He returned in October with everything he owned, which wasn't much. The settlement at Boone's Hollow was the nearest cluster of humanity. 4 cabins, a shared well, and a half-built church that wouldn't see a preacher until the following spring. The settlers tolerated him the way one tolerates a stray dog, with a mix of pity and suspicion. The first weeks were devoted to exploration. The cave ran back 40 feet from its entrance before narrowing to a passage barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Beyond that passage, Silas discovered what he would later call the long room, a chamber roughly 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, with a ceiling that rose to a natural dome 12 feet overhead. The air here was noticeably warmer. His thermometer read 64 degrees. The walls were dry, the floor smooth limestone worn by ancient water that had long since found a lower path. But the most remarkable feature was the far wall. It wasn't solid rock. It was fractured, a web of cracks running vertically through the limestone, and from those cracks came a faint but unmistakable current of warm air. Silas held his candle near the largest crack and watched the flame bend steadily inward, drawn by convection into the deeper earth, then push back outward in a slow, rhythmic pulse. The cave was breathing. He understood then what he was looking at. Somewhere below, perhaps 50 feet, perhaps 200, a geothermal feature was warming the rock. Not a hot spring exactly, though there might be warm water moving through the strata. More likely, it was the simple ancient heat of the earth itself, concentrated and channeled upward through fractured limestone that acted as a natural chimney. The cracks drew cool air in, warmed it against the heated rock below, and exhaled it back into the long room in a cycle as old as the mountain. Silas Crenshaw had found a cave with its own furnace, and unlike a wood fire, it would never go out. He began building in November. The entrance chamber became his workshop and storage. He hauled flat stones from the creek bed and laid a rough floor, filling the gaps with river sand. He built a simple wooden frame across the entrance, not a wall, but a skeleton to hold an oiled canvas that could be raised for ventilation in warm weather and dropped as a windbreak in cold. The canvas wasn't much to look at. Thomas Harker, passing below on his way to check his traps, called up that it looked like a man had hung his laundry across a hole in the hill. Silas didn't answer. He was busy solving a problem. The long room was warm, beautifully, miraculously warm, but the narrow passage connecting it to the entrance acted as a bottleneck. The warm air pooled in the long room and barely reached the front chamber. If he sealed the passage, the long room would stay warm, but he'd lose ventilation. If he left it open, the warmth would bleed out through the entrance every time the wind blew. He thought about it for 6 days. On the 7th, he built a door. Not a simple door. A double door, fashioned from split cedar planks, set into a frame he chiseled into the limestone passage itself. The principle was one he'd read about in a book on English mining. An airlock. 2 doors, spaced 3 feet apart in the narrow passage, with a small vestibule between them. Open the outer door, step in, close it behind you. Open the inner door, step into the long room. At no point were both doors open simultaneously. The warm air stayed where it belonged. It took him 2 weeks to build. The cedar was green and hard to work, and he split his left thumbnail to the quick with a misplaced chisel strike. He wrapped it with a strip of linen and kept working. When it was finished, he stepped through the double doors into the long room and felt the warmth close around him like an embrace. His thermometer read 65 degrees. Outside, the first hard frost of the season was killing the last of the asters along the creek. The first winter tested him, not because of cold. The long room held its temperature with a constancy that still astonished him, dropping no lower than 62 degrees even in January, when the air outside plunged to 9 below zero and the creek froze solid enough to walk a horse across. The settlers in their cabins burned through cord after cord of firewood, stuffed rags into the gaps between their logs, and still woke to frost on the insides of their walls. Silas woke to 63 degrees and dry air and the faint mineral smell of warm limestone. He kept meticulous records. Every morning at dawn, he read his thermometer and entered the number in a leather-bound notebook, the date, the time, the cave temperature, and his best estimate of the outside temperature based on ice formation, wind conditions, and the behavior of the creek. By February, he had enough data to confirm what he'd suspected. The long room's temperature varied by no more than 3 degrees across the entire winter, a range so narrow it would have been the envy of any furnace-heated home in Philadelphia. The science of it consumed him during the long evenings. He understood the basic principle: thermal mass. The limestone surrounding the cave weighed thousands of tons, and stone is slow to change temperature. It absorbed heat during the warm months and released it during the cold, acting as a massive thermal battery. But that alone didn't explain the 63 degrees. Pure thermal mass would stabilize at the annual mean air temperature, which in this part of Tennessee was closer to 55. The extra warmth came from below, from the geothermal gradient, the slow increase of temperature with depth that every miner knew but few understood. He calculated it one evening by candlelight. The Earth's temperature increased by roughly 1 degree Fahrenheit for every 60 feet of depth. The cave sat beneath perhaps 200 feet of solid limestone ridge. That alone could account for 3 or 4 additional degrees. Add the convective circulation through the fractured rock, warm air rising, cooling, sinking, rising again in an endless loop, and the mathematics worked out almost exactly. The earth was heating his home. It had been heating this cave since before the first human being walked upright. It would continue long after the last one was gone. No, what tested Silas was loneliness. He was 31 years old. He had not had a real conversation in 7 weeks. The settlers avoided the bluff trail. Dorcas Harker had told the other wives that the caveman was peculiar, possibly dangerous, certainly not the sort one invited to supper. When Silas came down to the settlement store, a single shelf of goods in Harker's front room, to buy salt and cornmeal, the transactions were conducted in as few words as possible. Salt, nickel, thank you. He retreated into his work. The long room needed shelving. He built it from cedar. It needed light. He experimented with reflectors, angling sheets of polished tin to bounce candlelight off the pale limestone walls until the chamber glowed with a warm, even luminance that was easier on the eyes than any fireplace. He carved niches into the walls for his books. He built a sleeping platform raised 2 feet off the floor, insulated underneath with dried cedar boughs, and covered it with a mattress he sewed from flour sacking and stuffed with cattail down. It was during the construction of the sleeping platform, in late January of 1854, that he made his first real discovery. He had been chiseling a niche into the wall behind where his head would rest, a shelf for his candle and his current book, when his chisel broke through into a pocket of open space behind the limestone face. He felt air, warmer than the room itself, exhale through the hole with a soft, almost musical tone. He widened the opening carefully with his hammer. Behind the wall face lay a cavity about 2 feet deep and 3 feet tall, its interior surfaces covered entirely in crystals. They caught his candlelight and threw it back in fractured brilliance, pale amber, honey gold, and a deep, glowing topaz that seemed to hold light within itself rather than merely reflecting it. Calcite crystals, he knew immediately. Dogtooth spar, sharply pointed crystals of optical-grade calcite that had been growing in this sealed pocket for perhaps 100,000 years, fed by mineral-rich water seeping through the limestone above. Silas Crenshaw knelt before that small, glittering cavity and forgot to breathe. He had seen mineral specimens in his father's collection, in the cases at the Academy of Natural Sciences in Philadelphia, where he'd once spent an afternoon pressing his nose to the glass, but he had never seen crystals in situ, still attached to the mother rock, still arranged as the earth had grown them, untouched by human hands. They were perfect. Each crystal terminated in a sharp, translucent point. The largest was the size of his thumb. He closed the hole with a flat stone and told no one. Spring came to the Cumberland Plateau in a rush of dogwood and redbird, and Silas emerged from his cave like a man coming up for air. He had survived his first winter without cutting a single cord of firewood. He had eaten reasonably well. Salt pork, cornmeal, dried beans, supplemented by rabbit and squirrel he trapped along the ridgeline, and on one memorable occasion in December, a wild turkey he shot with a borrowed rifle that he'd returned the same afternoon to avoid any debt of obligation. He had read 11 books, repaired his boots twice, and filled a notebook with observations about the cave's temperature, airflow, and geology. The settlers watched him come and go that spring with something closer to bewilderment than contempt. A man who lived in a cave should have been gaunt by March, hollow-eyed and desperate. Silas looked better than half of them. He had gained weight over the winter. The steady warmth of the long room meant his body burned fewer calories staying warm, and his food stores had lasted longer than he'd planned. His hands were calloused but uncracked. His clothes were clean. He walked with the unhurried ease of a man who had slept well every night for 5 months while his neighbors shivered. Dorcas Harker found this personally offensive. "It ain't natural," she told anyone who would listen, standing at the creek filling her water buckets while Silas passed on the trail above. "A man in a hole in the ground. He'll take sick. You mark it, he'll take sick and come crawling down here expecting Christian charity, and then what?" But Silas didn't take sick. He had a plan. Through the rest of winter, he had systematically explored every crack and crevice in the long room, carefully widening fissures with his chisel, mapping the geometry of the fractured limestone behind the walls. He drew careful diagrams in his notebook, cross-sections of the cave showing the orientation of each fracture, the direction of airflow, the location of moisture seepage. He was looking for patterns, and he found them. He found 3 more crystal pockets, smaller than the first, but each containing specimens of extraordinary quality. One held clusters of pale blue celestine crystals nested among the calcite like frozen flowers. Another contained a single massive calcite crystal, perfectly clear, nearly 4 inches long, with a double refracting property that made printed text appear doubled when viewed through it. He knew what these were worth. His father had sold specimens to collectors in Boston and New York for prices that would have astonished the farmers of Boone's Hollow. A good calcite crystal might fetch $5, a cluster of celestine, $20. The double refracting specimen, Iceland spar the collectors called it, could be worth $50 or more to the right buyer, particularly one interested in optical instruments. But Silas was patient. He did not hack the crystals from the walls. He studied them. He noted which pockets showed signs of active growth, a thin film of moisture, a faint residue of calcium carbonate deposited in concentric rings. These he left sealed and untouched. The crystals were still growing. To harvest them now would be to kill a process that had been running since before the first human set foot on this continent. Instead, he carefully extracted specimens only from pockets that had dried out, where the growth had stopped naturally, where the crystals were already as perfect as they would ever be. He wrapped each one in cotton batting and stored them in a wooden box he built specifically for the purpose, with individual compartments padded with dried moss. In April, he carried 6 specimens down the mountain and walked 12 miles to the post office in Jamestown, where he wrapped them in brown paper and sent them to a mineral dealer in Philadelphia, whose name he'd found in an old issue of the American Journal of Science. 6 weeks later, a letter came back with a bank draft for $47. Silas Crenshaw sat on a stump outside the Jamestown post office and read the letter twice. The dealer, a man named Emerson Pratt, praised the quality of the specimens, among the finest domestic calcite I have handled, and asked if more might be available. He was particularly interested in the celestine and would pay premium prices for large, undamaged clusters. $47. Thomas Harker's entire corn crop, if the season was good and the price held, might bring $35. He did not boast. He did not even mention the sale. He bought supplies, a proper iron stove small enough to fit through the cave entrance, not for heat, which he didn't need, but for cooking, new tools, a bolt of canvas, 10 pounds of nails, and 3 more books. He hired a boy with a cart to haul the goods back to Boone's Hollow, and he carried the stove up the bluff trail himself, resting every 50 yards, the cast iron cutting into his shoulders through his coat. The settlers noticed the stove. They noticed the new tools. Thomas Harker, who had spent the spring replanting corn in soil that was more clay than loam, watched Silas haul an 80-pound stove up a mountainside and said nothing. But that evening, for the first time, he walked up the bluff trail and stood at the cave entrance. "Crenshaw," he called. Silas appeared from behind the canvas windbreak, a chisel in one hand and limestone dust in his hair. "Harker." "I was wondering." Thomas shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "That stove. Did you buy it in Jamestown?" "I did." "With cash money?" "I did." Thomas Harker stood there for a long moment, looking at the cave entrance as though trying to see through the stone to whatever lay beyond. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back down the trail. He didn't ask what Silas did for money, but he stopped laughing at the caveman, and Dorcas noticed. And her silence, though less friendly than her husband's, was at least an improvement on open mockery. That summer, Silas expanded the long room, working alone with hammer, chisel, and a short-handled pickaxe, he widened the chamber by 4 feet on its southern side, following a natural seam in the limestone where the rock was softer and fractured along predictable planes. He had learned to read the stone the way a woodworker reads grain, tapping with his hammer, listening to the pitch, feeling for the places where the rock wanted to split. Each day, he removed between 20 and 50 pounds of limestone, breaking it into manageable pieces and hauling it out through the entrance passage to add to a growing wall he was building across the front of the cave. He squared the walls. He leveled the floor. He cut a ventilation shaft, a 6-inch channel angled upward through 12 feet of rock to emerge on the hillside above, hidden by a flat stone cap that could be opened or closed with a lever system operated from inside. The shaft created a gentle draw that freshened the air without losing heat. The engineering of it took him 3 weeks of calculation and trial before he got the angle right. Too steep, and the warm air rushed out too fast. Too shallow, and the draw was insufficient to clear the cooking smoke from his new stove. He solved it with patience. He always solved things with patience. By autumn, the long room was no longer a cave. It was a room, 18 feet wide, 26 feet deep, with squared walls, a level floor, built-in shelving, a cooking area with the iron stove vented through the original entrance passage, a sleeping alcove, a workbench, and, behind a cedar partition, a private study where Silas kept his books, his specimens, and his growing collection of notebooks. The walls, where he hadn't plastered them with a smooth coat of clay mixed with lime, showed the natural stratification of the limestone, pale gray bands alternating with darker layers of ancient seafloor sediment, each band representing thousands of years of deposition in an ocean that had covered this land 300 million years before. Silas found these layers beautiful in a way he couldn't quite articulate. They were evidence of time's patience. The earth had built this stone 1 grain at a time, and now he was building his home from it in the same way. His second shipment to Emerson Pratt in Philadelphia brought $63. It was Emerson Pratt who brought her to Boone's Hollow. Not intentionally. Pratt had written to say he was traveling south in the autumn of 1855 to visit mineral sites in Tennessee and Virginia, and would Silas permit a visit to see the cave formations firsthand? Silas agreed, and on a golden October afternoon, the maples on the ridge burning crimson and orange against a sky of depthless blue, Pratt arrived in a hired buggy with his niece. Her name was Clara Weil. She was 26, the daughter of Pratt's sister and a German-born watchmaker who had died in a cholera outbreak in Philadelphia 3 years earlier. Clara had been educated at a Quaker school in Germantown, where she had studied botany, chemistry, and mathematics with an aptitude that her teachers found remarkable and her relatives found inconvenient. An educated woman without money or a husband was, in 1855, a problem that most families solved by finding her a husband as quickly as possible. Clara had declined 3 proposals and showed no sign of declining fewer. She had come south with her uncle because she was interested in cave ecology, specifically in the blind white crayfish and translucent spiders that inhabited deep cave systems, organisms that had evolved in total darkness and lost the need for pigment or sight. She had read about them in a monograph by a naturalist at the Smithsonian and wanted to see them herself. Silas met them at the base of the bluff trail. Pratt was a round, cheerful man in his 50s, pink-faced from the ride, already sweating through his waistcoat. Clara was tall and thin, with dark hair pulled back severely and brown eyes that moved over the limestone bluff with the same systematic attention Silas recognized in himself. "Mr. Crenshaw," Pratt said, shaking his hand vigorously. "I've been selling your crystals to half the collectors on the eastern seaboard. They won't believe I've seen the source. There isn't much to see from outside, Silas said. That, said Clara Weil, looking at the cave entrance above them, is generally how caves work. Silas looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them smiled exactly, but something shifted in the air between them. A recognition, perhaps, of a shared language that had nothing to do with words. He led them up the trail. Pratt wheezed. Clara climbed without difficulty, pausing twice to examine lichen on exposed rock faces, producing a small hand lens from her pocket with the ease of long habit. The tour of the cave lasted 4 hours. Pratt was impressed by the crystals. He spent 20 minutes with the double refracting calcite, holding it over his pocket Bible and marveling at the doubled text. But Clara was interested in everything else: the thermal regulation, the airlock doors, the ventilation system. She asked questions that no one in Boone's Hollow had ever thought to ask, and Silas found himself answering in a way he hadn't spoken in 2 years, eagerly, fully, with the relief of a man who had been holding his breath without knowing it. "You've essentially built a passive climate-controlled structure," she said, standing in the long room with her hand pressed flat against the warm limestone wall. "The thermal mass of the surrounding rock absorbs heat in summer and radiates it in winter, maintaining equilibrium. The airlock prevents convective loss. The ventilation shaft allows moisture and carbon dioxide to escape without significant thermal exchange. It's—" She paused, searching for the word. "Efficient," Silas offered. "Beautiful," she said. Clara stayed in Boone's Hollow for 3 weeks. Her uncle left after 5 days, extracting a promise from Silas to send more specimens and a promise from Clara to behave herself, though it was unclear what misbehavior he feared from a woman whose primary vice was staying up too late reading by candlelight. She boarded with the Burrell family, the only household willing to take her, and that only because Silas paid them, and spent her days at the cave, cataloging the invertebrate life in the deeper passages, sketching crystal formations, and helping Silas design a system for collecting and filtering the mineral-rich water that seeped through the cave ceiling during rainy periods. They worked side by side in the comfortable silence of people who don't need to perform for each other. When they talked, it was about rock strata and crystal lattices and the migration patterns of cave crickets. When they didn't talk, the quiet was full rather than empty. On the 14th day, Clara found the secret room. Silas had known it was there. He'd felt the warm air moving behind a section of the long room's northern wall for months, heard the faint, hollow resonance when he tapped certain stones. But the wall was solid. No visible cracks, no obvious entry point. He had been planning to chisel through but had put it off, unwilling to damage the wall's surface, which bore a natural pattern of iron oxide staining that looked, in certain light, like a map of rivers flowing through red desert. Clara found the entrance from the outside. She had been hiking the ridgeline above the cave, collecting moss samples, when she noticed a depression in the forest floor. A sinkhole, perhaps 4 feet across, partially hidden by a tangle of mountain laurel. She cleared the brush and found an opening. Not a vertical shaft, but a sloping passage, angled downward at perhaps 30 degrees, wide enough to crawl through. She came to get Silas. Together, with ropes and candles, they descended. The passage ran about 25 feet before opening into a chamber that made the long room look like a closet. It was oval, roughly 30 feet across and 40 feet long, with a domed ceiling that rose to nearly 20 feet at its center. The walls were not limestone. They were flowstone, smooth, undulating sheets of deposited calcite that rippled across the surfaces like frozen water, colored in bands of cream, amber, and deep rust. Stalactites hung from the ceiling in dense clusters, some as thin as soda straws, others thick as a man's forearm, their tips glistening with moisture that caught the candlelight and held it like trapped stars. But the floor was the revelation. It was covered, entirely, uniformly covered, in a forest of stalagmites rising from a bed of crystallized calcite that sparkled like snow in sunlight. The stalagmites ranged from an inch to 3 feet tall, and among them grew crystal formations unlike anything Silas had seen or read about. Branching, tree-like structures of pure white aragonite, their delicate limbs spreading outward in fractal patterns that seemed to defy the weight of stone. The room was warm, warmer than the long room. Silas's thermometer read 68 degrees. The air was humid and still, and smelled of clean mineral water and deep thyme. Clara Weil stood in the center of that underground cathedral, turning slowly in the candlelight, and said nothing for a long time. "It's been growing for 1,000,000 years," Silas said quietly. "Maybe longer." "Don't sell these," she said. It wasn't a request. It was a statement of shared understanding. Some things are not inventory. Some things are not for sale. "No," he said. "Never." They stood together in the silence of a room that had waited a geological age to be seen by human eyes, and Silas understood, with a certainty as solid as the stone around him, that he was not alone anymore. They married in the spring of 1856, in the half-built church in Boone's Hollow that now had a circuit-riding preacher and a congregation of 11. None of the settlers came to the wedding except old Josiah Burrell, who had grown fond of Clara during her stay at his cabin, and who gave them a smoked ham as a wedding present. The preacher, a lean Methodist named Reverend Aldridge, who had ridden 40 miles from Crossville, was visibly uncomfortable performing the ceremony in front of a congregation of 1, but he did his duty and wished them well. Clara moved into the cave without complaint. She brought her books, her microscope, her collection of preserved cave invertebrates in small glass jars, and a rocking chair that her mother had shipped from Philadelphia at considerable expense. The rocking chair fit perfectly in the study alcove, beside Silas's workbench, where the candlelight was best for reading. Their first evening as husband and wife, they sat in the long room, Silas at his workbench cleaning a newly extracted calcite cluster, Clara in her rocking chair with a journal open on her lap, and listened to the cave breathe. The warm air moved through the fractured walls with a sound like distant sighing, steady and rhythmic as a heartbeat. Outside, a spring rain was falling, and they could hear it faintly. Not the rain itself, but the water it became, trickling through cracks in the limestone overhead, beginning its slow journey through stone that would take years or decades before it reached the crystal cavities below. "Are you happy?" Silas asked. Clara looked up from her journal. "I'm in a warm room full of books with a man who asks interesting questions," she said. "What else would I need?" Together, they transformed the cave. Not the secret room that they left untouched, visiting it only occasionally, always with the reverence of people entering a place that didn't fully belong to them. But the long room expanded steadily under their combined intelligence. Clara designed a rainwater collection system that channeled water from the hillside through a series of limestone filter beds, layers of crushed rock of decreasing size that removed sediment and organic matter, into a stone cistern she and Silas carved into the cave floor. The cistern held 60 gallons and refilled itself after every good rain. Silas built a second sleeping chamber for the children they hoped to have, carving it from an alcove off the main room and fitting it with the same double-door airlock design he'd used for the entrance passage. Clara planted a garden on the south-facing slope below the entrance, using the warm air that vented from the cave to create a microclimate that extended her growing season by 6 weeks in spring and fall. By their second year together, she was growing tomatoes and peppers that no one else in the valley could ripen before frost. The mineral business grew. Silas refined his extraction techniques, developing a method of removing crystals that involved weeks of patient work, first widening the access to a pocket, then gradually chiseling away the matrix rock around each specimen, using progressively finer tools until the crystal could be lifted free with its termination points intact. A single good specimen might take 3 days to extract. Silas considered this reasonable. The crystal had taken 10,000 years to grow. 3 days to remove it properly was the least he could offer. He shipped quarterly to Pratt in Philadelphia and to 2 new dealers, one in Boston, one in New York. Annual income from specimens averaged between $300 and $400, a sum that would have been respectable for a country lawyer and was extraordinary for a man living in a cave. He saved most of it, spending only on tools, books, supplies, and occasional improvements to the cave, a better stove, glass panes for a window he cut through the entrance wall, a writing desk he ordered from a furniture maker in Nashville. Word of the caveman's prosperity reached his brothers eventually. Marcus wrote a letter in 1857, suggesting that Silas might consider investing in a general store Marcus planned to open in Asheville. Silas did not reply. Henry, who had sold his timber and spent the proceeds on a horse breeding venture that failed when 3 of his stallions died of colic, wrote nothing but reportedly told his wife that Silas had always been odd and would come to a bad end. But it was Clara's work that attracted wider attention. Her monograph on cave-adapted invertebrates of the Cumberland Plateau, written by candlelight in the long room, illustrated with her own meticulous pen and ink drawings, was published in 1858 in the Proceedings of the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. It was, as far as anyone could determine, the first scientific paper on American cave ecology published by a woman. The paper brought visitors, not many, at first. A professor from the University of Virginia who spent 3 days measuring temperatures and airflow, pronouncing the cave's thermal regulation a phenomenon of considerable scientific interest. Then a journalist from a Nashville newspaper who wrote a long, somewhat breathless article about the caveman of Boone's Hollow and his remarkable underground home. Then more visitors, a trickle that became a steady stream through the late 1850s and into the years before the war. Silas showed them the long room. He showed them the airlock doors, the ventilation system, the crystal pockets with their amber and blue treasures. He showed them how the cave maintained 65 degrees while the world outside baked or froze. He never showed them the secret room. That was for family. The war came and went. Silas was 39 when Fort Sumter fell. Too old for the first rush of volunteers, though not too old to serve. He didn't. East Tennessee was divided territory, neighbor against neighbor, and Silas had no interest in fighting for either side. He had spent 8 years building something that had nothing to do with politics or slavery or states' rights. The cave didn't care who was president. He moved his family, Clara, their son Amos, born in 1857, and their daughter Lydia, born in 1859, deep into the cave when Confederate foragers passed through the valley, and again when Union scouts came looking for bushwhackers. Both times, the family retreated to the secret room, sitting among the stalagmites and aragonite trees with a single shielded lantern, while Boots tramped through the valley below. Little Amos, 4 years old during the first incursion, sat perfectly still with his hand on a stalagmite, feeling the stone's warmth against his small palm. Lydia, too, slept in Clara's arms. The cave kept them safe both times. Stone doesn't take sides. There were harder moments. In the fall of 1863, a group of Confederate irregulars, not soldiers exactly, but armed men who used the war as license for theft, found the cave entrance and spent an afternoon trying to persuade Silas to come out. He had sealed the airlock doors and braced them with timber. The men shouted threats, fired 2 shots into the entrance passage that ricocheted off limestone and harmed no one, and eventually left to find easier targets. Silas spent that night repairing the outer door and teaching Amos how to whittle a whistle from a piece of cedar, because a boy's hands need something to do when his mind wants to be afraid. The Harker family did not fare so well. Thomas Harker enlisted in a Confederate regiment in 1862, leaving Dorcas and their 3 children to manage the farm alone. He died of typhus in a camp near Murfreesboro without ever firing a shot. The news reached Boone's Hollow 6 weeks later, carried by a one-armed corporal who had shared Thomas's tent. Dorcas stood in her doorway and listened to the corporal's account without expression, then walked inside and closed the door. She sold their claim the following spring and moved to Knoxville, where she took in laundry. She never spoke to Silas again, though, whether this was from resentment or simply the erasure of circumstance, he never knew. The Burrell brothers split, one gray, one blue, and neither came home. By 1866, half the cabins in Boone's Hollow stood empty, their roofs sagging, their gardens gone to goldenrod and sumac. The war had drained the valley of its people the way a drought drains a creek, slowly at first, then all at once. Silas bought 2 of the abandoned claims for back taxes, not to farm. He had no interest in farming, but to protect the watershed above his cave. The forest on those hillsides filtered the rainwater that fed his crystal formations. Cut the trees, and the water would carry silt instead of dissolved minerals. The crystals would stop growing. He paid $11 for 80 acres, the price of a nation's grief reduced to pennies per acre, and felt nothing like triumph, only responsibility. He was thinking in centuries now, possibly longer. The years after the war were the fullest of his life. The mineral business expanded as the country rebuilt itself, and the appetite for natural curiosities grew among the newly wealthy classes of the Gilded Age. Collectors in Boston and New York paid premium prices for Crenshaw specimens, which developed a reputation for exceptional quality. Each crystal extracted with a care that left no chisel marks, no chips, no evidence of the human hand that had freed it from the rock. Pratt, who remained Silas's primary dealer until the old man's retirement in 1878, once told a customer that buying a Crenshaw crystal was like buying a piece of the earth's patience. Clara's scientific correspondence brought her into contact with naturalists across the country. Louis Agassiz wrote her a letter praising her invertebrate illustrations, calling them the finest I have seen from any American observer, regardless of sex. A compliment that was simultaneously generous and condescending in a way that Clara found more amusing than offensive. She framed the letter and hung it in the study alcove, where it served as both a point of pride and a reminder of how far the world still had to travel. A young man named John Muir, passing through Tennessee on his famous 1,000-mile walk in 1867, stopped at the cave and spent 2 days in conversation with both Crenshaws about the relationship between geology and ecology. Clara later found a brief mention of the visit in Muir's published account. He described the cave as a warm stone womb in the cold mountain and treasured the line for its accuracy. News of his brothers reached Silas occasionally, carried by letters or travelers or the slow circulation of family gossip that moves through the American South like groundwater through limestone, invisible, persistent, and impossible to stop entirely. Marcus's General Store in Asheville had opened in 1858, struggled through the war years, and closed permanently in 1867 when Marcus could no longer secure credit from his suppliers. He moved his family to Atlanta, where he worked as a clerk in a cotton brokerage until his death from a stroke in 1881. He was 59. His wife, Eleanor, survived him by 20 years and never once mentioned Silas's name in any letter that reached Tennessee. Henry's story was bleaker. The failed horse breeding venture was followed by a failed dry goods partnership, a failed attempt to grow tobacco on land better suited to rock, and a final, desperate effort to mine mica from a hillside in Yancey County that produced exactly $40 worth of mineral before the shaft flooded. Henry died in 1874, at 52, in a rented room in Burnsville, North Carolina. The same sort of rented room where their father had died 21 years earlier. The symmetry was not lost on Silas, who paid for his brother's burial and said nothing about it to anyone except Clara. He could have had the books, Silas said that evening, standing at the cave entrance, looking out over the valley where the autumn light was turning the maples to fire. He could have had the compass, the hammer, any of it. He chose the timber. Clara put her hand on his arm. He chose what he could see, she said. You chose what you could imagine. It was the kindest epitaph Henry would ever receive. Amos Crenshaw, their son, grew into a quiet, serious boy who shared his father's patience with stone and his mother's precision with language. By 14, he could identify 37 mineral species by sight and was keeping his own observation notebooks in a handwriting so careful it might have been typeset. He had his father's hands, large, steady, capable of holding a chisel for hours without trembling, and his mother's eyes, brown and quick and always measuring. Silas taught him the way Amos Sr. had taught Silas, not through lectures but through proximity. The boy worked beside his father in the cave, learning to read limestone by sound and touch, learning to recognize the faint darkening of stone that indicated moisture behind, learning the patience required to free a crystal from its matrix without damage. By 16, Amos could extract a specimen as cleanly as Silas himself, and his notebook entries were beginning to contain observations that surprised his father. The Celestine in Pocket 7 has resumed growth, Amos wrote in January of 1874. A thin film of new crystal, perhaps 1/16 inch, has been deposited since my last measurement in October. Growth rate appears seasonal, correlating with autumn rainfall. The mechanism must be increased hydrostatic pressure, driving mineral-saturated water through the fissure network at higher volume. Silas read this entry and felt something he hadn't felt since kneeling before the first crystal pocket in 1854. The dizzying joy of watching someone see the world clearly. Lydia, fiercer and more restless, learned to read at 4 and announced at 7 that she intended to attend a university, a statement that Clara supported without hesitation and that Silas found entirely reasonable. Where Amos was still water, deep, clear, revealing its secrets only to patient observation, Lydia was a mountain stream, fast and bright and capable of cutting through rock by sheer persistence. She excelled at mathematics with an intuitive grasp of spatial relationships that made her father's cave engineering seem simple. At 12, she redesigned the ventilation shaft's lever system, replacing Silas's original mechanism with a counterweighted arrangement that required half the force to operate. Your daughter, Silas told Clara one evening, watching Lydia sketch the new design on a piece of butcher paper, is going to build something extraordinary. She already has, Clara said, looking at the sketch. She just doesn't know it yet. The secret room became the family's private sanctuary. On winter evenings, when the wind howled across the plateau and snow piled in drifts along the ridgeline, Silas would light a lantern and lead his children down the crawling passage into that glittering underground cathedral. The passage had been improved over the years, widened slightly, fitted with handholds, its floor smoothed. But it was still a crawl, still an act of deliberate effort that separated the secret room from the everyday world above. They would sit among the stalagmites and aragonite trees while Silas told them what he knew about the slow, patient processes that had built this room. How each crystal represented thousands of years of mineral deposition, how the flowstone walls recorded changes in climate and chemistry stretching back beyond the reach of human memory. He showed them how to hold a candle at an angle to make the aragonite branches cast shadows that looked like winter trees on the flowstone walls. He taught them to sit quietly and listen to the water, the faint musical dripping that was the room's heartbeat, each drop carrying dissolved calcite from the surface to be deposited, molecule by molecule, on the formations below. The earth is always building, he told them, even when it looks still, even when you can't see it. There's always something growing in the dark. Amos listened solemnly and wrote the temperature in his notebook. Lydia asked if she could calculate the growth rate, and when Silas said she could try, she spent the next 3 months developing a measurement system using thin copper wires laid against the surface of selected stalagmites. The growth was invisible over any human time frame, perhaps 1/1000th of an inch per year. But Lydia was undiscouraged. She was learning to think in the earth's time. Clara, sitting in the amber light with her husband and her children, surrounded by 1,000,000 years of patient creation, was content. She had come to Tennessee expecting to study cave invertebrates for a season and had instead found a life. It was not the life anyone in Philadelphia would have predicted for her. A Quaker-educated woman living in a cave with a self-taught geologist and 2 children who thought stalactites were toys. But prediction, she had learned, was a poor substitute for observation. Silas Crenshaw lived to be 78 years old. In his later years, he slowed but did not stop. His hands, which had swung a hammer and held a chisel for nearly 5 decades, developed a tremor in his early 70s that made fine extraction work impossible. He handed that task to Amos, who by then was a geology professor at the University of Tennessee, and returned to the cave every summer to continue the family's careful harvesting. Silas spent his final years doing what he had always done best, observing. He sat in the long room with his notebooks and his thermometer and recorded temperatures, weather patterns, and the slow changes in the cave's ecosystem with the same meticulous attention he had brought to his first winter in 1853. His last notebook, number 43, contains an entry dated February 12, 1900. Temperature 64 degrees Fahrenheit. Steady. Light condensation on the northeast wall near pocket 12, suggesting active mineral transport. Growth continues. The cave is unchanged from my first winter here. It does not age as we age. It merely persists, and in persisting, creates. I have tried to do the same. He died on a March morning in 1900, the first spring of a new century, in the long room he had carved from raw limestone 47 years earlier. The room was warm, as it had always been warm, as it would always be warm. 64 degrees. His thermometer, the same mercury instrument his father had given him, hung on the wall beside the shelf where his notebooks stood in a neat row, their leather spines darkened by years of handling. The morning light came in through the glass window he had cut into the entrance wall decades ago, casting a rectangle of gold across the floor. It was the first thing he'd seen every morning for 47 years. That square of light moving slowly across the stone as the earth turned, steady as a heartbeat, faithful as time. Clara was beside him. She was 71, her dark hair gone silver, her hands still steady enough to draw the translucent cave spiders she had studied for half a century. She held his hand and felt the warmth of it. Not the cave's warmth, but his own, a man's warmth, fading. "There's more," he said. His voice was thin but clear. "Behind the north wall of the lower room. I could feel the air moving. There's always more to find." Amos was there, a grown man of 43 now, a geology professor who had published his own papers on Cumberland Plateau stratigraphy, and who had spent his professional life translating into scientific language what his father had understood by instinct. Lydia was there too, 41, a professor of mathematics at Maryville College, one of the few institutions in the South that hired women faculty, who came home to the cave every spring and fall, bringing her own children to sit among the stalagmites and hear their grandfather's stories. Silas looked at them, his son, his daughter, the grandchildren hovering at the entrance to the sleeping chamber, small faces solemn with the gravity children assume when they sense that something important is happening, even if they don't understand what, and smiled. "Don't seal anything up," he said. "Leave the cracks open. You never know what's growing behind them." He died with his eyes open, looking at the limestone ceiling he had lived beneath for nearly half a century. The stone that had sheltered him, warmed him, revealed its secrets to him one crystal pocket at a time, asking nothing in return but patience. They buried him on the ridge above the cave, in a plot he had chosen himself, marked by a slab of native limestone that Amos dressed with his own hands. From the grave, you could look east across the valley and see the morning sun hit the bluff face, lighting the cave entrance like a lantern. A dogwood tree grew beside the plot, and each spring it bloomed white and pink, scattering petals across the stone like confetti at a celebration nobody had organized. Clara lived another 12 years, dying in 1912 at the age of 83, still sharp, still writing, still descending into the secret room on her better days to sit among the formations and read by lantern light. In her final years, she wrote a memoir, never published, kept in manuscript in the family, that described their life in the cave with the same precision she had brought to her scientific papers. One passage, often quoted by family members at gatherings, read, "We did not choose to live underground. We chose to live in partnership with the earth, which is a different thing entirely. The earth asked very little of us: patience, attention, a willingness to be surprised. In return, it gave us warmth, beauty, and the rare privilege of watching something ancient continue to grow." She was buried beside Silas on the ridge. Amos carved the inscription himself: Clara Weil Crenshaw, 1829 to 1912. She looked deeper. Amos maintained the cave for another 30 years after his mother's death, retiring from the University of Tennessee in 1920 and returning to the long room to spend his final decades exactly as his father had spent them, observing, recording, thinking, in stone. He expanded his father's mineral collection, developed a comprehensive geological survey of the cave system, and continued the family's practice of selective, sustainable crystal harvesting. He never took a specimen from a pocket that was still actively growing, just as his father had taught him. Some of those pockets had been growing, undisturbed, for 50 years under Crenshaw stewardship, some for 100,000. Amos donated over 300 specimens to the Smithsonian Institution, where a display case of Crenshaw calcite and celestine can still be found in the Mineral Hall, labeled with a small card that reads, Cumberland Plateau, Tennessee, collected by S&A Crenshaw, 1854 to 1910. The Crenshaw calcite specimens are notable for their exceptional optical clarity and the care with which they were extracted, preserving the natural termination faces. Lydia's daughter, Margaret, became a geologist, the first woman to earn a doctorate in geology from the University of Chicago in 1923. Her dissertation was on the thermal dynamics of cave systems, drawing extensively on 67 years of temperature data recorded in her grandfather's notebooks. The data, she noted, constituted one of the longest continuous climate records maintained by a private individual in American history. Margaret's son, Thomas Crenshaw, named for the settler who had mocked his great-great-grandfather's cave, became an architect who specialized in earth-sheltered housing. In the 1970s, during the energy crisis, he designed a series of homes built into hillsides in Tennessee and Kentucky that used the same passive geothermal principles Silas had discovered a century earlier. The designs won awards. Journalists asked Thomas where he had gotten the idea. "My great-great-grandfather figured it out in 1853, he told them. "With a thermometer and a chisel. I just added insulation and better plumbing." The cave is still there. The long room has been designated a Tennessee State Natural Area, protected from development. The airlock doors, rebuilt once, in 1923, by Amos using the same double-door design his father invented, still function. The ventilation shaft still draws. The temperature inside, measured now by digital sensors that feed data to a climate research station at Vanderbilt University, holds steady at 64 degrees Fahrenheit, winter and summer, year after year. The secret room has never been opened to the public. By family agreement, maintained across 5 generations, it remains as Silas and Clara found it, a cathedral of stone and crystal in deep time, lit only when a Crenshaw descendant carries a lantern down the sloping passage and sits for a while in the warmth of the earth. Modern geothermal scientists have a term for what Silas Crenshaw discovered in 1853: passive geothermal regulation. The cave's thermal stability results from a combination of factors: the high thermal mass of surrounding limestone, the insulating effect of the overlying ridge, and the slow convective circulation of air warmed by the Earth's natural heat gradient, that maintain a nearly constant temperature regardless of surface conditions. It is the same principle that modern Earth-sheltered homes exploit with engineered precision, using technology and mathematics and computer modeling and thousands of dollars worth of equipment. Silas had none of that. He had a thermometer, a hammer, and the willingness to pay attention. He had his father's books and his father's compass, and the memory of a man who died poor but curious, who looked at rocks and saw stories, who passed on not money or land, but the far more durable inheritance of wonder. The settlers of Boone's Hollow are gone. Their cabins rotted and fell and were absorbed by the forest floor decades ago. The chinking crumbled, the hearths went cold. The fields they cleared with such labor returned to poplar and oak and hickory within a single generation, the forest reclaiming what had been briefly borrowed. You can still find the stone foundations if you know where to look. Low rectangles of stacked rock, half buried in leaf mold, slowly sinking into the soil. They are monuments to effort, but not to endurance. The creek still runs, clear and cold, over the same limestone bed it has been polishing for 10,000 years. The ridge still stands, its gray face streaked with iron oxide and draped in cedar, unchanged in any way that matters, since the day Silas first looked up and saw the dark mouth of the cave, and felt, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, that he was looking at home. The cave still breathes. drawing cool air in through its fractured limestone lungs, warming it against the ancient heat of the deep earth, exhaling it back into a room where a man once knelt before a pocket of golden crystals and understood that the world gives its best treasures not to those who grab, but to those who look. Behind the north wall of the secret room, the air still moves. Something is still growing in the dark. There's always more to find.